Okay, however, before I begin to address our journey as the Moravian Church in the British province in and after COVID, I think it's important to acknowledge that the COVID pandemic is not the first time that the Church has faced an existential crisis, if indeed it is doing so. And it is still here and will continue to be here in some form or another, if not in its current form. If you know anything about your biblical history, you'll know that before Christ, the Jews faced many existential challenges in the Old Testament through oppression by the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and the Romans, among others. And each time they have come through by following strong leadership, by journeying through the circumstances, and by adapting. By following strong leadership, by journeying through the circumstances, and by adapting, whilst never losing a sense of their identity and of their purpose with God. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar, has described the journey of the Jews in the Old Testament as a process of orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And if you look at this particular model here that's in front of you on the screen, you can see those kind of stages as well within this, but perhaps expressed in a different language. The same process happened for the early Christians in that they were persecuted many times and were able to reorientate again. And I suppose these days you could argue that our oppressor, if we have one, is one of apathy rather than a particular grouping of people. And even in our Moravian history, the Czech-based Moravian Church was nearly wiped out in the 30 Years' War before being eventually renewed in Herrnhut in the early 18th century. So the talk today is not intended to be pessimistic, but to be realistic. And it's important to acknowledge the journey of the Christian faith and of faith generally, that it sometimes goes through these times of challenge before it is renewed again, because God's word is within it. I do believe in facing realism rather than burying our head in the sand, because we have to do so, I think, before we reorientate wisely. So turning to the church in COVID, let's look at it in terms of the sudden impact phase. So we were faced with this pandemic, and the way we responded to it was very much to kind of lock down. And if we think that church is first and foremost about relationship and about community, in which we worship God, that is, the worship of God is central to our purpose, the COVID pandemic caused us to rethink what it means to worship and what it means to be community. At a time when we could no longer gather together because of the lockdown, could God still be present when 2 or 3 are gathered together in his name, even if it is over Zoom? The pandemic threw up all kinds of theological questions, such as, why has God allowed this to happen? And it made many of us more aware of our mortality than perhaps we were before, and even made us question some of the theological precepts in our sacraments, particularly around Holy Communion. And we still have Holy Communion over the internet in that sense. Some of us, including myself, lost loved ones, folks who are close to us, and plummeted us into grief. And so whether we acknowledge it or not, COVID has impacted us in the church. And in responding to the need for continued worship and pastoral support, we entered what might be called the heroic phase, in which various congregations and ministers heroically tried to plug the gaps in worship and community through the provision of innovative Zoom services, worship on the web, regular, weekly, and sometimes even daily telephone conversations, which were pastorally designed to combat the isolation, Zoom Bible studies, Zoom prayer meetings, even a Zoom synod in which we could vote electronically. And even, I think, in the Irish district, there was a driving for Stingle. These are just some of the many ways in which we responded heroically to the situation that we were faced with. And this involved, for some, learning new IT skills and adapting to worshiping and operating in a different context. That provision showed us that as a church, which could be described as traditional, that we could pragmatically adapt on a needs-must basis. It also involved creative innovation and enabled the church to expand beyond the frontiers of the British province to include brothers and sisters from other provinces in worshipping and studying together. It gave us a better sense of worship practices that go on in other parts of the unity. And whilst there have been many advantages to these heroic changes and responses, there has also been a shadow side for the church too. This might be identified in our model in front of us as the disillusionment phase. Some ministers, who are only human after all, have perhaps questioned their vocation and their ability to do the work effectively, perhaps bringing thoughts of retirement closer to mind. Many elderly and other members haven't wanted to embrace the new technology, but have instead craved physical human connection. There has also been a financial impact on many congregations as giving has become unstable, with not getting out regularly to church. And our Moravian schools have faced financial crisis as international borders haven't been able to travel, and parents have demanded refunds for online provision of education instead of the face-to-face tuition that they thought they had paid for. And these issues, among others, have seriously impacted the British province, financially and otherwise. It has been difficult to provide a ministry for young people in many congregations, as interactive ministries are more difficult on Zoom, and many youth leaders haven't wanted to work physically with young people, who are perhaps unfairly regarded as the vectors of infection. Community lunches and dementia cafes have all been halted, as work with the vulnerable, although highly needed at this time, has proved just too risky. And just as things started to return to some sense of greater normality, the virus mutated again, leading to further restrictions and greater pandemic fatigue. For many ministers and church leaders, it has been difficult to preach a gospel of hope and not become disillusioned, whilst accompanying many who are disillusioned. How do we hold some sense of Christian resilience as we journey through a pandemic that seems to have no obvious end? Now, turning to the church after COVID, what we might see there as the rebuilding and the restoration phase, because we don't know how long the pandemic will continue for and what will be left of our church. It is really quite difficult to know how to reconstruct it. And there is no blueprint for recovery. Nobody's been here quite like this before. The scientists say that pandemics usually last about 5 years, but that is not a guaranteed period of time. And with the remarkable vaccines and medicines that have become available to us, that timeline may indeed be shortened. Yet other variants may come along and prolong it. We just don't know. Life has an uncertainty about it. Currently, the situation in the British province is that we have just over 1,000 members, if we leave out the numbers from the LEP in Hall Green in Birmingham, which probably would take us up to about 1,120. So in terms of Moravians, we have just over 1,000 members within 32 congregations, some of whom are just about holding on from closure. And they are served by 70 ministers, at least 8 of whom will be eligible for retirement in the next 10 years. there are generations missing in most of our congregation, and the future looks problematic. Whenever the pandemic ends, what will remain, however, is a continued need for a lived experience of God's presence and a need to worship him in some form or another as a response to our spiritual need as human beings. People will seek different ways to relate to God as part of their recovery from the pandemic. There is still a societal need that is poorly met by political social provision. How might the church be part of that? There is a mental health pandemic among our young people. How might the church play a part in bringing young people to faith, where God is the touchstone of resilience in the lives of believers? There is much social isolation in our communities. How might the church play a vital role in befriending the lonely? There is much homelessness and plenty of refugees. How might the church play a part in providing for their needs through providing language classes, housing, and community building? How can we build up the church through transforming ourselves so that Christ lives more in us, and so that people want what we have as his light shines from us? How can we enable a ministry that enables everyone's gifts and honors everyone's gifts, in which people feel called to work for Christ and be used in such a way by the church that they aren't squashed into our one-size-fits-all approach to worship and ministry? There certainly isn't a lack of spiritual need out there. It's just that I'm not sure we know how to meet it anymore. Or maybe we've lost confidence in ourselves, even as ministers. Reconstruction is certainly needed. However, reconstruction doesn't just mean entering into another heroic phase by trying to come up with loads of new initiatives, which in the Moravian Church are usually social or fellowship-based initiatives, without thinking about a wiser living phase, which is the final stage of this model. This, in my view, begins by first starting with where people are, by first acknowledging the loss and assessing the abilities, the energies, and the gifts that are and even aren't around us in our congregations. Entering a wiser phase of living can mean beginning by asking difficult questions that perhaps we don't want to face. One of these might be, is the Moravian Church in the British province terminally ill and in need of end-of-life care, to put it bluntly? If it is it therefore lacking compassion to say that we've got to get better, that we've got to begin new initiatives for which there is little energy and no real desire to renew? Might a more pastoral and sensitive response be a winding down of our province? Is there enough desire and capacity for growth and survival among us? And if so, what does that look like? Are we too thinly spread in terms of resources, with each congregation putting their own self-interests first, without looking at how their continued need to exist with very small numbers and a seeming lack of purpose impacts on the bigger picture and thus makes the province able to offer a less effective ministry? How can we build ourselves up as the body of Christ before we look at outreach? Is there the appetite for meeting social and spiritual need in our community and for living out our faith beyond the church walls under the banner of the Moravian Church? Is there a vision? For where there is no vision, the people perish. There is no doubt that the church needs to go where God is, to participate in God and to make God possible and known to others if it is to survive. However, that may first be in facing the death of our usual self to enable its resurrection. Or it may be in regrouping wisely and re-establishing a vision, and in the recognition that we who are alive and remaining must redouble our efforts to seek the renewal and growth of our church through having a vision for our church. If our present and future is the end of life care of our province, because we have fulfilled our purpose for being, we must not see any closure or integration of congregations or even our province with another province as failure. Instead, we must see it as a wise acknowledgement that maybe we have now lived the purpose for which God intended us or our congregations, and that it is time to end. For everything, there is a season. Or is God extending and maybe re-establishing our purpose in how we respond wisely beyond the pandemic? If so, what is our vision? So there are lots of questions whose answers I think need to be faced honestly in order to discern a way forward. Yet within all of this, ultimately, there is a recognition that we are here not because we've chosen to be, but because God has chosen us to be. Not because we decided it was a good idea, but because God called us and has drawn us and guided us and will continue to do so. And that is such a reassurance when our faith is tried and tested and we worry about if we can hang on in there, to know that our faith journey is not just our initiative, but God's, and that we are held in the orbit of his divine grace. None of us knows what the coming year holds, let alone a more distant future. However, it is by the grace of God that we are here today, and it will be by the grace of God that we will be here over the next year and in the year after, if God wills, and if we will it too. We may find ourselves mysteriously further drawn by the pull of divine grace in a direction that we've maybe not thought of yet, but we will have to play our part too. So what will be your part? What will be our vision? To end, I want to leave you with a very simple and yet I think profound and achievable vision, maybe, which might be a starting point for us to think about. And it is to be a light in the darkness, transforming our communities one person at a time. To be a light in the darkness, transforming our communities one person at a time. If our church is to continue in this province, this, I think, is what we need to work at. To be a light in the darkness, transforming our communities one person at a time. And the rest then is in God's hands. One very quick, final, and perhaps very simple thought is that if each person who is a member of our church were to bring one other to Christ, to become a member of the British province, then we would double in size. Now that's a thought. And finally, might the apathy that surrounds us in society towards our faith have also pervaded us too. Thank you.